Good morning. Oh my goodness. Y'all are so funny. Thank you, buddy. Okay. So here we go. I am so excited about this week. Once I get this all sorted out. Hold on. Wait a minute. Look at me go. What's that bottle flipping thing that the kids were doing for a while? I'm a bottle flipper. Okay. I messed it. Okay, there we go. Now we're good. And set. Well, that's been. So if you're here this week, we've had so many technical difficulties this morning. The lights that are here normally are really bright and they're awesome, but for whatever reason this morning, they've decided not to function for us. We had some glitches with the lyrics. We had all kinds of stuff this morning, but you know what? We're so glad you're here. I'm glad not because that there's another seat filled. I'm glad because this morning we're better because you're in your place. We're better as a church. We're a church because you came. If not, it's me standing in the room by myself. So number one, I'm glad you came for that reason. But number two, really, we are in week 5 of what has been messy. I did it again. Look at me go. All right, we're just going to leave it there this time. So we're in week 5 of what is our messy series. And our messy series, we started week 1 with the prodigal son. And so the kind of the path has been beginning at what if you're a mess and you're far removed from God, and we talked about the amazing grace of God. And so the heart of the Father was when the Son was removed and living a life that was displeasing to the Father and everything else. But when he turned his heart towards home, the Father went running to him and threw his best robe on his son's shoulders, put a ring on his finger, sandals on his feet, threw a feast for his son. And that really speaks of, you know what, God is not mad. He is not angry. He did not demand an accounting of the prodigal son. Where's the money I gave you? How come you smell like pigs? None of that. I'm just glad you're home. And really, that's God's heart for us, the amazing grace of God. And that's one. Week 2, we moved into Jacob. And I'm going to do this in 2 minutes or less, this recap. So if you're here and it's your first time, I want to get you caught up to where we are. Week 2, we talked about Jacob. And Jacob, the main thought for Jacob was that God is not at all interested in blessing who you pretend to be. He is, though, wildly, passionately interested in blessing who you really are. God is not at all concerned with whether or not you wear khakis to church or if you wear shorts to church. This is going to be the kind of church where you're always welcome just as you are. But more than the dress and attire, God wants you to just be open and honest. God, this is where I'm at. These are the things I struggle with. These are the things that cause me pain. And I give them all to you. When you get real with God, man, he'll bless that. He's all about that. Then we talked about Moses, and that was in week 3. And Moses really was the understanding. Moses had this burning bush, and the burning bush revelation for Moses was when God says, I am with you, and I'm for you. First, Moses gave 5 excuses why God picked somebody else, pick anybody else but me. Please don't let it be me. And God heard all of Moses' excuses, and he finally said, Moses, it's you that I want. I'm going to send you where you don't want to go, but I'll be with you. As a matter of fact, I'll go before you. I'll be here before you get there because I'm already there. And if we'll have trust and peace and faith in God to say, God, you are with me, you are for me, and we got to get it past our head knowledge and get it into our heart. And how do we do that? We talked about Philippians chapter 4, verses 6, 7, and 8. And so if you were here for that, you probably still hopefully have Philippians 4, 6, 7, and 8 that you wrote out and put on your mirror or on your refrigerator or on your desk somewhere where you see it every day. Because we need to train our mind to dwell on what sort of things are true, lovely, of a good thing, praiseworthy, or virtuous. I want to think on those things because the world is going to try to trick you into dwelling on all the ugly things. What if this goes wrong? What if that goes wrong? I prayed and I gave it to God, but what if it doesn't work out after all? You gave back the peace he gave you in verse 7 because you didn't do what he told you to do in verse 8, which is think on the right things. That you're with you, that he's for you. He's not angry at you, that he loves you with passion and fire. The words, as a matter of fact, God calls it, the Bible calls it the all-consuming fire of God's love. That's amazing. So last week we did something that was different and fun. Hope and I had a chance to co-teach our BC Relationships weekend for Valentine's Day weekend. And by the way, one of my very favorite things to do is to get a chance to speak with Hope. It's always fun. It's always exciting. But you know what? That takes no preparation. We have a couple of stories. We have scriptures that are important to us that we share. We talk about our marriage philosophy and a relationship philosophy. And we're believing that somehow that God's going to use that and bless you. And you know what? We got lots of great feedback from last week. It helped some people. But let me tell you, that takes no preparation. That is just Hope and I being on stage and just kind of being who we are. What I didn't know, as I thought, that gave me 2 full weeks to prepare for today. We're going to be talking about the life of David. And what we're doing is we're rounding a corner. We started off the Mercy series talking about what if you're away from God, what's God's heart towards you? It's amazing grace. We got into Jacob and being authentic with God. We got into Moses and understanding that he is with us and he's going ahead of us so we can have peace in him. Today we're rounding a corner. So what does it look like then if I've been walking with God, but I mess up? What does it look like when I love God, but my life seems to be drama, tragedy, and train wrecks, and what's going on? So today we're going to get into David, and David gives me a lot of hope. David is one of the most vital characters in the Bible. And I say that because the Bible dedicates 66 chapters to the life of David. It dedicates 14 chapters to Abraham, and 14 chapters to Joseph. And by the way, those are both mentioned in the New Testament, which is great. But he also spends, the next runner-up to Abraham and to Joseph would be Elijah, and Elijah gets 10 chapters. And he also mentioned the New Testament. David, by comparison, has 66 books, or 66 chapters in the Bible dedicated to communicating the story of his life. More than that, he's mentioned the New Testament 59 times. It says a lot that second only to Jesus, we're told the story of David in such great depth, because clearly there's something about this life that God's trying to get us to see. And the truth of the matter is there's more than one thing. But man, there's something so incredible about this life that David lived. As a matter of fact, he's called a man after God's own heart. And he's called that twice. He's called a man after God's own heart in 1 Samuel chapter 13. And he's also called a man after God's own heart in Acts chapter 13. And that's significant because that is the exclamation point on his life. See, in the beginning, when he's called a man after God's own heart, he hasn't lived it yet. He's just a man that loves God and is pursuing God. But when 1 Samuel chapter 13 is referencing a man after God's own heart, that's before David messed up. You see, David messed up, and he didn't mess up a little, he messed up big. I mean, capital S, capital I, capital N, sin. He messed up big. And so it's almost like you can look and say, well, if he is an adulterer, which he is, he's a murderer because he had the woman he was cheating with, her husband was killed at David's command. He's also a failure as a father because, and the story of Absalom and Tamar, and he messed up. These are things we understand if we put in the context of, well, that was before he knew God. No, this is after he'd been walking with God. And yet he's still called a man after God's own heart. David was the greatest single king in the history of Israel. He's the king, by the way, that never fought a battle he lost. Nobody else can say that besides Jesus. Never fought a battle he lost. There's so much hope in that. Because David was called a man after God's own heart in Acts after we knew the full story. After we knew how he blew it. After we knew how he messed up. Listen, in my story, you don't have to go back that far before you find the spots where I blew it and I messed up. So there's hope for me in this life of David. So what sets David apart? David authored 73 Psalms. 73. More than any other author of Psalms. David wrote more Psalms than anyone else. We're going to look at specifically Psalm 51 and Psalm 69 today. That are Psalms that point to, there's no way to describe it, a traumatic childhood. Those passages, along with the way that he was treated as a young boy when Samuel comes to his father's house and says, bring me your sons. Jesse invites all of his sons but David. And David, he leaves that in the field. And I've heard pastors talk about that maybe points to the fact that David might have been an illegitimate son. I spent a lot of time preparing for this week. So in preparing for this week, I read, there's a book called A Tale of Three Kings. I read that from front to back, and then I read it again from front to back because it was just so stirring some things up in me. This week, the last 2 weeks, God has been bringing some things up in me that he says it's time to let those things go. and put those things in the right perspective. He's been bringing some things up in me that, hey, Leif, these are some things you got to get right. These are some things you need to work on. And man, I thought I was doing good. And you start to realize, no, that God's still working on me. I've got areas where I need to grow and get better and get further down the road. And so as God has did me for 2 full weeks in preparation, and by the way, it's reading the Bible and reading a Tale of 3 Kings and doing some study. There's a book called the Talmud, and if you're familiar with Jewish history, you know the Talmud is a book of law and a book of history that is central to Torah law. And so the Talmud describes a lot about David's childhood. Along with Jewish tradition, David's mother is mentioned in the Bible. In the Talmud, it's very clear his mother was a woman named Netzevet. And I really, really wish, guys, that I had a whole day to just talk about Netzevet. Netzevet is a champion of faith because she is falsely accused of a great sin and manages to hold her tongue. More than falsely accused, she's looked down on, she's judged, she's criticized. She's not falsely accused, she's also falsely convicted of something she wasn't guilty of. They assume that David is an illegitimate son. I wish I had more time to tell you why he's not, but David was assumed, and by the way, David thought he was an illegitimate son. In Psalm 51, verse 5, he says, "In iniquity I was brought forth, in sin my mother conceived me." So, even David struggles with, what's my lineage? What's my legacy? And it's interesting that he was born into the family of Jesse because Jesse, again, according to the Talmud and Jewish tradition, Jesse, this was not some random family. David was born into a prominent family in Israel. Jesse, was the head of the Sanhedrin, which would be like the high court of Jewish law. This is a well-respected, prominent family. So when David is sent out to the fields to watch the sheep and the goats, in a prominent family, that's not a job you give a son. That's a job you give a servant. So David is treated on several occasions. As a matter of fact, in Psalm 69, David writes, "I was a stranger to my brothers, a foreigner to my mother's sons. They put gall in my food and gave me vinegar to quench my thirst." Sent out to the fields, given the job of a servant, not a son. And while he's in the fields, alone and isolated, rejected like an outsider, he called out to God. Maybe this morning you can already relate to David's story because the people who should love you most have treated you like an outsider. Maybe you're here this morning and you just feel alone or forgotten. I've got really, really, really good news for you. David's life, more than any other, sums up and characterizes the Romans 8:28 through 30 passage. I'm going to read it from the NLT. It says, "And we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. For God knew his people in advance, and he chose them to become like his son, so that his son would be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And having chosen them, he called them to come to him. And having called them, he gave them right standing with himself. And having given them right standing, he gave them his glory." So David is treated like a despised one. David is sent out into the fields like a servant, not a son. David's mother is accused. David is treated as not really a son, despised and rejected. How could that work out, according to Romans 8:28-30, in David's favor? Without getting too far down the road of Calvinism versus Arminianism, let me just tell you the Arminianism doctrine would simply state that all of us, having been created by God and endowed with free will, have the ability to reach out to God. In that context, you look at Romans 8:28, and Romans 8:28 says that those he foreknew, you had the right to choose. It's not predestination where some he wanted and some he didn't. He wants us all. But he knows that some will choose him. So before you're ever born, God is scrolling through the storyline of your life. He's looking for one thing and one thing only. Is there going to come a day when they're going to trust me? Is there going to come a day when they put their faith and hope in me? Is there going to come a day when they want a relationship with me? And if there is, if there is that day, then he gets to work. A car wreck that was going to take you out and kill you, he's going to protect you from that because you've got to get to the day you're going to have a meeting with him. That sickness that was going to take you out or cripple you or cause you to be incapacitated in some way, good news for you. God said no. He's going to make it to the day. And if that wasn't enough, that would be great news by itself. But even more than that, God is looking at everything in your life from before you even had your moment with God to say, God, I want you. I need you. I put my faith and trust in you. God goes all the way back to the very beginning and says, no, that's not just not going to kill him. I'm going to use even the hard things, even the difficult things, because I'm weaving a story into their life. I'm not saying that God caused the hard things in your life, but I'm saying he loves you so much, he's not going to let one tear go to waste ever. He's going to work it into your story because he's got a plan for you that's bigger than you know. God's grace and God's mercy is so poured out on you that you know what? If God allowed it, he will use it. So David finds himself alone in the fields with goats and sheep as his companions. In desperation and despair, David cried out to God. And he chose to make God his closest friend. In the meantime, David learned to play the harp and sing as he wrote songs of praise to God. David wrote 73 psalms. He also learned to use a sling as he defended the flock that was entrusted to him. That skill set in particular is going to serve him well. When a wild bear, on another occasion when a lion came and attacked a lamb, you see, if you're a servant, that's dangerous. You run away. As a son, you've been entrusted this responsibility. You don't run from the lion. You don't run from the bear. You run at the lion, and you run at the bear. David runs at the lion and at the bear with nothing but a sling. Again, he's honing his skill he's one day going to use to fight a giant. That's what's next. So David is at this point, and I'm taking you down a road, and the reason I want to go down this road, this morning I want you to understand that this is not, God doesn't allow me to just get up here and share cute messages. For the last 2 weeks, God has worn me out in the most positive sense. I've cried, I've read, I've reread, I've prayed, because God's doing something significant, and it starts in me first. But then after he's worked it in me, guess what? It's for us. Today's going to be one, in Jesus' name, if I communicate it right, one of the most significant messages I've ever shared. And I'm not saying that to hype you up. Yeah, come on, let's go. I'm saying that because I want you to lean in and listen close, because I believe God's going to speak to us this morning. God's going to take those things that we look back on. Why'd that have to happen? We can see ourselves almost as a victim in hard times and hard things. God says, listen, I don't want you to see that as a victim. I want you to see that as providence. If I allowed it, I'm going to use it. Okay. So, guys, if you'll just lean in with me for the next about 25 minutes, I believe that we're all going to walk away changed. Because I know what he's done in me through this message, and I'm believing in Jesus' name he's going to do it in you. What I mean by that is, when we're done today, I believe as a body of believers, we're going to be closer in our walk with God. We're going to mature in our faith. We're going to change our momentary fly by the seat of a pants casual faith, and we're going to start growing towards God. I trust you in all things, not just the easy things. I trust you in all things. When it's ugly, I trust you. And when I have victories, I trust you. When I have victories, I give you all the praise and the glory. When I mess up, I'm going to be quick to repent and give it back to you, because God, you work all things for my good. David, let's get back to David. He's in the fields with sheep and goats. But then chapter 16 of 1 Samuel, God sends Samuel to Bethlehem, specifically to the house of David, to the house of Jesse, to anoint a new king to take the place of Saul, whom by this point God had rejected. It begins in verse 6. It says, when they arrived, Samuel took one look at Eliab and thought, surely this is the Lord's anointed. But the Lord said to Samuel, don't judge by his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Then Jesse told his son Abinadab to step forward and to walk in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, "This is not the one the Lord has chosen." Next, Jesse summoned Shemaiah. But Samuel said, "Neither is this the one the Lord has chosen." In the same way, all 7 of Jesse's sons were presented to Samuel. But Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen any of these." Then Samuel asked, "Are you sure? Are you sure this is all your sons?" "They're still the youngest," Jesse replied, "but he's out in the fields, watching the sheep and the goats." "Send for him at once," Samuel said, "and we will not sit down to eat until he arrives." That's significant. You have to imagine the brothers' position just for a minute. This is the boy that they've rejected. This is the boy they've treated harshly. This is the boy that they put gall in his food, gave him vinegar when he was thirsty. This is that boy. And now they're being told by the man of God, "We won't even sit down until he gets here." And by the way, he was out in the fields. This is not going to be 5 minutes. They're going to have to wait a while. And we won't even sit down until he gets here. God is reframing who David is, even in his family's eyes. Listen, this is honor. You won't sit down until he walks the room and sits down first. You're not moving from this place. And in his brothers' minds, "Are you crazy? David? We're gonna stand up and wait on David?" God says, "That's my anointed. Don't play." So they stand and wait for David to arrive. So Jesse said for him, he was dark and handsome with beautiful eyes. And the Lord said, "This is the one, anoint him." So as David stood there among his brothers, Samuel took the flask of olive oil he had brought and anointed David with the oil. And the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David from that day on. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David from that day on. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David from that day on. What does that mean? What does that look like? David walks in. The man of God is there. The Spirit speaks to the man of God, and he says, "That's the one." Samuel says, "Kneel." He breaks out the olive oil, and he hears the words, and so does his family. He knows these words. These are the words you pronounce over somebody who is the one of God, the next king. David probably is in shock. Who are you talking to? He pours the entire vessel of oil over David's head and said, "Behold, God's anointed." Amazing. From despised and rejected to anointed. And ordained the next king of Israel. But the part of the story that's not often understood is between the anointing and his coronation, there's 20 years. 20 years. Wouldn't you think that after the anointing, okay, here's the next king. Bring me the crown. Let's move this ball forward. But no. 20 years go by. He knows he's the next king. He's been anointed by the man of God. The same one, by the way, who anointed Saul is now anointing him. But time passes. And it doesn't happen. And time passes. And by the way, Samuel, by the way, when this whole thing is over, he goes home. And David is sent back out to the field with the flocks. But I'm the anointed king. Where's my crown? What do you mean I have to go back out to the flocks? Have you ever felt like you have a purpose and that God has a plan for you? Maybe somewhere between the time you felt the call or got the anointing and walking what God's planned for you, there's time that passes. And maybe you become frustrated or begin to even doubt there was a plan. Did I really hear from God at all? It may not happen as soon as you'd like, but the good news is God's promises and his purposes are sure. They're sure. So I was 16 years old, and I was at a summer youth camp my church had put on. And Ron and Carrie Webb were our youth pastors, and they stood up in front of the group. And I think it's in the bylaws of every church camp. They have to do it. It's a part of the plan. Like, you don't get away. You can't do a church camp unless the last night of the church camp, you do it in the altar call and say, listen, if you feel like you're called to full-time ministry, raise your hand and come forward. We won't pray over you. And, I knew at 16 when Ron Webb said, raise your hand if you feel called to full-time ministry. I knew. That's me. Two things happened next. Number one, self-doubt. Immediately, self-doubt. Well, he's not talking to me. No, that's just pride, my own ego. I'm not somebody God would use. Has anybody ever felt that way? I'm not the one God would use. No, that's got to be my own pride and ego that God's not really calling me. And the second thing, when the call of God doesn't go away, okay, what would it look like if I did say yes to God? At 16, I did not understand that we're custom made by God for the purpose he has in mind for us. So to me, in that moment, when I thought, give my life to full-time ministry, what I imagined was, that means I have to move to a third world country. I have to live in a grass hut with a dirt floor. I have to have an ugly wife. I have to have no money to my name. I'll be forgotten by my friends and family. Isn't that what it means to serve God? I did not understand that God has equipped you and made you specifically for the purpose he has in mind for you. If I was supposed to be in a third world country living in a grass hut with a dirt floor and not an ugly wife, because God loves me, she'd at least be pretty to me, and my wife is gorgeous, so it all worked out. But let me tell you, if it had been God's purpose for me to go be a missionary in a third world country, hearing about the grass hut and the dirt floor would have lit my soul on fire. Oh, that sounds great. I can't wait to go. I didn't know that at 16. At 16, giving your life to full-time ministry looked rough, and so I doubted and I didn't trust God. But here's the thing. I knew I should have gone forward. Beyond the self-doubt, beyond the fear, I knew that was me. But I sat on my hand, I sat still, I didn't go forward. Fast forward 24 years. I'm sitting in a church service and a pastor that I love and respect and have served for, at that point, I think 14 years of time. I'm sitting in a service, and he stops in the middle of everything. There's actually our Dream Team Awards. He stops in the middle of everything. He says, hold on a second. He says, Leif Angel. Yes, sir. He says, when I look at you, I don't see Leif Angel, I see Pastor Leif. And God takes me back to 16 years old and Ron Webb saying, if you feel called to full-time ministry, raise your hand. You see, when God has a purpose and a plan for you, the timing might not look like what you think. For David, it was 20 years. For me, it was 24 years. But you know what? God had this in mind. This, me standing with you this morning, he had this in mind when I was born. Before I was born. The good thing about God is we know his plans are perfect. We know when he has a purpose for us. Number one, that we're made for that. I was made for this moment. I was made for this. Now, this might not be everybody's story, but God's got a purpose and a plan for you. And when you step into it, you will never be more alive than you are in that moment of time. The hard thing is, sometimes when we get the vision and say, okay, God, you've got a purpose and a plan for my life, the next thing is you have to go back to the sheep and the goats. What do you mean sheep and goats? I'm a king. Okay, king. Right now you're king of the sheep and the goats. There is a promotion after this day, and his family does begin to see him differently. Not long after he's anointed, David gets a promotion to the role of messenger. Okay, when you're not tending the sheep, I want you to go to take a message and take supplies to your brother and bring home word of how they're doing. And where are his brothers? His brothers are with the king on the front lines of battle. And he sends David to bring them supplies and bring back news of how they're doing. And on one of these trips, David encounters Goliath. Wow. So David encounters Goliath, and he goes from being a shepherd boy to hero. Y'all can be honest. When you heard us talking about David this morning, you thought, well, he's going to talk about David and Goliath. He's going to tell the story about, okay, stay. He's going to tell the story about the slingshot and the 5 smooth stones. And if he's going to talk about David, he's going to talk about David and Goliath. Okay, that's good. But there's so much more to his life. We get fixated on that one moment in time. But, the story of David and Goliath, David was stepping into what God had prepared him for with the lion and the bear. The Goliath was what was next. Here's the hard thing that we don't always understand. Sometimes the hard things we deal with. So, for example, how many of you work out in the gym? Okay, that wasn't funny. Like never? Okay, got it. So if you've ever worked in a gym, you know, if you've ever had a trainer, what you don't want, what you actually want at the moment, what you don't need in reality, is you don't need a spotter who, the minute you start struggling, takes that weight back off of you. You're bench press, you're on the bench, you're going, and you start to struggle, and as soon as he sees you start to struggle, oop, let me take that off you. It feels good in the moment. But a good spotter gives you just enough help, fingertips, for you to finish that rep. Why? Because it's in the struggle that we grow. We like a spotter that takes the weight off of as soon as we start to struggle. But if you have a spotter that takes the weight off, you will never get any stronger. You have to have a spotter who's willing to let you struggle. So God lets David fight a bear. But God, you're supposed to protect me and defend me. Yeah, I'm going to send you a bear. Okay, I handled the bear. Great. Next, lion. Awesome. Where are we going with this, God? You're supposed to be my defender and protect me. I'm not supposed to go through hard things. After all, I'm blessed. I'm the next king. Well, king, handle the lion next, because you're preparing for the giant. And wouldn't it be great if that was the end of the story? And by the way, most messages on David, that's where we stop. See, David battled Goliath, and whoo, yes. Goliath was just the next thing, because there's something after Goliath. It's Saul. Oh, shoot. So how awesome that he goes from shepherd boy to hero in a moment of time. How amazing and thrilling that was, and how much that would have messed with my head if I was in David's position, because I would have been thinking, this is it. This is finally here. My moment has arrived. I'm about to be king. This is it. Finally, the prophecy, the anointing is coming true. Actually, the hardest and darkest days of David's life were just about to begin. David was summoned back to the palace often to play the harp and to sing for King Saul, who was beginning to go mad. And one of the only things that could soothe his tormented mind was the music David learned to play. Where? Minding the sheep in the fields, alone. Okay, God, you used it. Romans 8:28, you used it. And here I am in the palace with the king. And the things I learned in the field, I now get to put into place. Wouldn't it be great if that was the end of the story? Nope. Saul has heard all the hot girls in the street, all the pretty girls, when David defeats Goliath, and then David goes and pays the bride price for Michal, and it's 200 foreskins. I'm sorry if you have kids in the room. We have children's ministry. But that the bride price for Michal is 200 foreskins. Sorry. So David comes back after Goliath. He comes back after battling Philistines. And there's the cute girls in the street. They used to sing about Saul. And now he's in the song, but what they're singing is Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s. Saul knows, because Samuel told him he's been rejected by God, that his replacement is on the way. And here's this kid, this shepherd boy. Yeah, he won me some battles, but if he thinks he's going to be king, this is my throne. Let me ask you a question. Whose throne was it? It was always God's throne. But Saul begins to rely on his own strength and say, this is my throne. You think you can take my throne? You're crazy. So he's sitting there. The only way he gets peace is when this shepherd boy comes and sings and plays a harp for him. But he's battling with this almost manic depressive state of he goes from peaceful to a fit of rage. You think you're going to take my throne? And he picks up the spear and he hurls it right at David's head with all he's got. It sticks in the wall. If you're David, what was that about? I was just singing to you. What happened with this? What was that about? So here's the thing. David is younger. He's stronger. He's faster. He sees a spear coming in his head and he ducks. What do you do when somebody throws a spear at you? I tell you what most of us do. We pick up the spear and we throw it right back. We get insulted, so we insult back. Somebody hurts us or offends us, we're going to be offensive and hurt them right back. We really get good at the art of throwing spears. Here's point number 2 this morning. It is the right of kings to throw spears. Kings have the right to throw a spear. They have all the power and all the authority, and who's going to hold them to account? Kings get to throw spears. It's what they get to do. As a matter of fact, throwing spears comes naturally. You get to handle your stuff. Oh, you're going to stand up to me? Hold on a second. Catch this spear in the face. Kings have the right to throw spears. David, though, is looking at Saul differently. We look at Saul in this story, and all we see is this mad king, this jealous, maniacal, mad king who's been rejected by God. But David looks at Saul, and he sees something different. He sees the man who was anointed by God to be in that throne. No, God anointed Saul and gave him that throne. And I might be next, but Saul's got it now, and he's the one that's anointed by God. He's looking at Saul and saying, that's the guy God used to take the wandering tribes of Israel who were disconnected and have no affiliation whatsoever, this wandering tribe of nomads. And he says, you know what, I'll use that guy to forge them into a nation. Before Saul, there were the judges. And the people of Israel had been just pillaged and really just run roughshod by every surrounding neighborhood, by every surrounding kingdom. They got just beaten on, and God had to raise up judge after judge after judge to defend them. God uses Saul, a great king, by the way, to take this wandering group of tribes and unite them together as a kingdom. God uses Saul to take farmers and herdsmen and shepherds and forge them into an army. And not just an army that goes and defeats all of God's enemies, all of God's people around him that are giving him a hard time. God uses Saul in a powerful way. So David is looking at Saul not as some cartoony villain that's twisting his waxed mustache and tying a girl to the railroad tracks. David looks at Saul and says, that's my king. So honor and reverence, he doesn't have the option to pick up the spear and throw it back. Sometimes, and this is going to be difficult to hear, because sometimes, like David, God knew what David needed most to become the king that God had David in mind to be, is a Saul. God uses David's traumatic childhood, and now God is using this mad king. Those are the anvils and the tool I'm going to use to shape David into be the kind of king that I want him to be. Because if it were not for the time in the field, he would not have learned to sing and write psalms. If it were not from dealing with a mad king, and sometimes you have to deal with difficult authority, and everybody has got something to teach you, even if it's just how not to be. Everybody's got something to teach you. So God puts David under this mad king and said, you know what David needs most right now? A Saul. Okay, first you gave me a lion and a bear, and then a giant, and now this king who really enjoys throwing spears at my head. Because Saul goes from fits of rage and throwing spears to apologizing and never happen again, but sure enough, it happens again. It's the right of every king to throw spears. But if David's not going to fight King Saul because of the honor and reverence he has for the king, the only option he has left is to run. So for years, David is exiled. For years, he sleeps in caves. For years, he sleeps in holes in the ground. For years, he sleeps in exile behind foreign enemy lines. He starts out, by the way, all alone. God begins to add people to him, but he started out alone. This is the man who had been anointed by God. This is the man, by the way, who said back in 1 Samuel 16 that the Spirit of God rested heavy on David for the rest of his life. Where's he at now? He's sleeping in the back of caves. God is using a difficult childhood. He's using a mad king. Because, David, I want you to be a different kind of king. You're not going to learn the fine art of throwing spears. That's not what I have in mind for you. David chose not to be a spear-throwing king because he still had the heart of compassion he learned as a shepherd in the fields. And he chose to wait on God's timing instead of making his anointing happen by his own strength. More than once, he had the opportunity to throw spears back at Saul, the man who had made himself David's enemy, the man who had abused him, the man who had ruined his reputation, the man who tried to kill him on several occasions. He has the opportunity to kill himself, to throw spears back. Once in a cave while Saul was going to the bathroom. Again, kids ministry. Once while King Saul was in the middle of his camp asleep, and his guards are asleep. He could have made it happen. As a matter of fact, he didn't even have to do it. He just had to not stop his followers from being the one to do it. Hey, David, let me kill this guy for you. No. He didn't have to do it. He just did not stop his servants from doing it. Interestingly enough, in 1 Samuel 31, King Saul finally meets his end, but it's not at the hands of David. Interestingly enough, it's at the hand of the Philistines. Why is that interesting? Because God had used David to defeat the Philistines once already. If Saul hadn't made an enemy out of David, there's every chance God uses David to defeat him again. But Saul didn't have his mightiest warrior when he needed him because he had made David his enemy. Be careful who you make your enemy. So what's the news? What's the response that David and his men have to the death of King Saul? In 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 11 through 12, and again in 17 and 18, it says that David and his men tore their clothes in sorrow when they heard the news. What news? That Saul was dead, and so was Jonathan. There wasn't congratulations. There wasn't pats on the back. They didn't start calling him King David in that moment. It wasn't time. Instead, they ripped their clothes in sorrow and they mourned. They mourned and wept and fasted all day for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the Lord's army and the nation of Israel, because they had died by the sword that day. Then David composed a funeral song for Saul and Jonathan, and he commanded it to be taught to the people of Judah. It is known as the Song of the Bow, and it's recorded in the book of Jashar. So what is it about this life of this young man who would become the greatest king Israel had ever known? What is it that made him a man after God's own heart? Point 3 this morning is that David maintained an attitude of dependence on God, unlike Saul. Saul thought that the throne was something to be defended. Saul thought that the throne was his own. And anybody else who's going to come up and try to take my throne, they're going to get the business end of a spear. David not only doesn't see it that way, but when his son Absalom tries to take the throne, he gives it up willingly. It's not my throne, it's God's. What's the difference between David and Saul and Absalom and every other king? What makes David a man after God's own heart? I'll say this, David had a teachable spirit. He gave God all the credit and victories. And he immediately repented when he realized he had sinned later in his life. In 1 Chronicles chapter 21, David takes a census when he'd specifically been told not to. And in so doing, he brings a curse on the entire nation of Israel. In 2 Samuel chapter 11, David sleeps with one of his soldiers' wives. When she becomes pregnant, he had his own soldier, Uriah, killed rather than be discovered in his sin. Both times, when he's corrected, he doesn't give excuses or try to justify why he was okay. Instead, he quickly repents before God. In the good times, he gave God all the praise. In his failings, he fell on his face and repented. According to Romans chapter 28, if God allows the hard things, by the way, even our own failings, if God allowed it, he'll use it for our good. David didn't maintain a victim mentality. Sometimes he would cry out. He would cry out to God about what's happening. He would quickly talk himself back around by remembering who God is and trusting him to be faithful. He patiently waited and waited and waited and waited after he knew his calling and purpose. When he could have thrown spears, he chose to show honor instead. What is spear throwing in our modern understanding? Throwing spears, we don't do that a whole lot anymore. But what we do is we get reckless and careless in our authority. We forget that the throne we sit on as a husband or as a wife, as a father or a mother to our kids, as a worker, as an employer, as a boss, as a manager, we get careless and reckless with our authority. And we use the authority we've been given by God to care for the ones he's entrusted to us. Instead, we use that same authority to hurt them. We can look at Saul and say, what a jerk, what a loser. But you know what? The first time I take my authority as my son's father recklessly and say things that pierce his very heart, I just threw a spear. Why did David choose not to throw spears? In honor and reverence for this crazy, crazy king. Because that's God's man, and I'm called to serve him. And I can take authority right now. All I have to do is pick up this spear. I won't do it. He wanted a king after his own heart. He wanted a king who understood what it means to live with a broken spirit. Broken not in the terms of woe is me, sad little me, but understanding that, man, it's all God's. Any authority I have, any giftings I have, any ability I have, it's all God's. Any blessings I have, any victories I achieve, it's not because I'm so great. It's because my God is good and he's faithful. He goes before me. Why is David a man after God's own heart? This is not a lightweight message. I'm sorry if you wanted something super light and easy to take away and one or two quick points. I want us to capture this heart. And when you try to capture a king's heart, it takes longer and it's a little deeper than what's easy to quickly digest. Maybe you identify with David because you felt like an outsider and mistreated by those who should have loved you. Maybe you feel like David because you've had spears thrown at you. Maybe like David, you've been waiting on your purpose and your promise. Maybe you feel like David because you've messed up worse than you ever imagined you would. See, there's the amazing grace of God that he gives us when we're far from him. But then there's the sustaining grace of God that is the very oxygen we breathe. When we come to God and say, I'm a broken man. I'm not worthy. I'm a broken man. But Jesus, only say the word. Only say the word, and I'll be healed and whole again. The heart of a king. The heart of a king who doesn't want to be another spear-throwing king. He doesn't want to be Saul the second. God's got a different purpose and plan for David. When he felt broken and alone, he worshiped and cried out to God. Maybe you're in that 20-year span in the waiting. The waiting was when David honored imperfect authority and trusted God to make it happen rather than trying to make it happen in his own strength. Maybe like David, you've messed up so bad. How do I get back up from this? Does God still love me? Is there any hope for me? I know God. I love God. Can't believe I made the mistake I made. Listen, his mercies are new every morning. He loves you and he's for you. He's saying, get up, dust yourself up, keep coming, keep following me. Okay. There might be some consequences we have to go through, but you know what? God is so good, we don't even have to walk through the consequences alone. He's still with us, just like Moses. He's still with us. He still goes before us. What is the heart of a king? Our response, like David's, should be to bless when we've been cursed. If I allow authorities in my life to teach me at least how not to be, the day will come when my coronation happens. His promise is sure. His purpose will not fail. What he said over you will happen. It might take more time than you thought, but it's in the waiting that we prove our faith and trust in God. It's in the waiting when we say, okay, I've got imperfect authority, and you don't even understand. They're wearing me out at work. My boss is a jerk. Good preacher. Maybe you're here this morning and you're beginning to realize maybe I've been the Saul in this story. Maybe I'm the one that's throwing spears and taking my authority lightly and hurting people that I'm called to serve as a leader. This message this morning is for all of us. How do we have the heart of a king? Always, always, always maintain a dependence on the goodness of God. I cannot do this on my own. Jesus, I'm not worthy. I'm broken. But only say the word, and I'll be healed and whole again. Only say the word. Every victory I have, I don't have because I'm so great. I have because you're so great. Every hard thing I go through, I never go through alone. That God, you love me so much that according to Romans 8:28, even the hard things I've had to walk through, maybe the hard thing I'm walking through today, you love me so much that you will all things, even this thing, together for my good. You didn't cause it, but you'll use it because you love me so much. You're never willing to let one tear go to waste. You'll use it if I'll give it to you and trust you with it. Our message this morning is simple. It's deep and it's profound, but it's really simple. It's time to trust in God again. It's time to trust in God on a whole new level. Maybe you need to reframe the things that have happened. Maybe you need to take the things that have happened and hurt you and wounded you. And you look back and you're angry, even bitter, even still today. And you say, you know what, God, if you allowed it, you'll use it. That might have been my season in the pasture with the sheep and the goats. Maybe that's my season with a mad king throwing spears at my head. But God, if I'll trust you with it, I can get healing for it. If I'll trust you with it, it'll be my preparation for the coronation that happens next. In Jesus' name. Amen.